Delegates for the day. It's been our fifth edition of the PG program, supported by Microlabs. So on this day, we are going to have the bedside case discussion done. On behalf of Microlabs, I take an opportunity to welcome each and every one of you for this Regain PG program. I request Dr. Balaji as well as Dr. Ranaji, who are the moderators who have been guiding all throughout this program, to welcome all the audience and help us start this program. Over to you, Dr. Balaji.
Thank you, Mr. Raja. I'm grateful to you for helping us in arranging this wonderful program during the lockdown. It is almost 2 months now. Every Monday from 9 a.m. to 10:30, we are holding this bedside mainly for exam going DM and DNB students. And this is attended by students all over India and even Nepal, Bangladesh and other countries. And every time we have a very experienced examiners who take this bedside. And we are very thankful and grateful to Professor Amit Gupta, Head of Nephrology at SGPGA Lucknow, for having acceded to our request to take this bedside. He is a very, very experienced examiner, and I'm sure all of us, all the students will benefit from his expertise. Over to Professor Amit Gupta. The student this time who is exam going is Dr. Ganesh from Narayan Hridayalaya Hospital in Bangalore, and he will be presenting the case. Professor Amit Gupta and Dr. Ganesh, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Bhalla. Now we can start the case.
Yeah.
Dr. Ganesh.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir. Sir, today I am presenting a case of Mr. SP, who is a 43-year-old male, software engineering by occupation, studied up to BTech, came from Bangalore, history given by himself, and is a known case of ESRD on CAPD since past 8 years. Now came for follow-up to OPD with a history of recent admission for loose stools, and at present he is asymptomatic. I would like to date back his history to 1994, when patient was 17-year-old, developed symptoms of facial puffiness, which is insidious in onset and gradually progressive over next few days, which is not associated with swelling of legs or distension of abdomen. There is no history of blood in urine or decreased urine output, and there is no history of fever, throat pain, joint pain, rash, or oral ulcer. He was evaluated for the facial puffiness and found to have leakage of protein in the urine. However, he doesn't remember the quantification of protein. And he also told that his creatinine and blood pressure at this point of time was normal. He underwent an uneventful renal biopsy, and he remembered the report of the biopsy as FSGS, for which he was treated with oral medication, details of which he doesn't remember. After a few days of starting his medication, his facial puffiness reduced, and he was told that his proteinuria is decreasing. He was in follow-up for another 4 months and told that at the end of 4 months and told that there was no proteinuria and advised to stop his medication completely. He denies any history suggestive of side effects to medications like facial puffiness, weakness of limbs, striae over abdomen, infections, acne, or high sugar. Later, he checked his urine for proteinuria twice in the next 3 to 6 months, which was told that is normal, and after that he lost to follow. He was asymptomatic and there were no significant events till he attained age of 33 years. In 2010, when he was 33-year-old, patient had easy fatigability, which is insidious in onset and gradually progressive over next 2 to 3 months, and it is not associated with any fever, night sweat, decreased appetite, weight loss, and denies history of nausea, vomiting, pedal edema, shortness of breath, or decrease in urine output. He was evaluated for fatigability and found to have high blood pressure, high creatinine, and small kidneys, for which he was initiated on hemodialysis through right side neck vein temporary catheter, which was electively placed, and he was vaccinated for hepatitis B vaccine, and he is advised for transplant. He was started working up for transplant with brother as donor. During this period of time, he was undergoing hemodialysis at another nearby hemodialysis center. Patient developed fever, and he had a urine output of around 1000 ml per day during this time. After 1 month, patient developed fever, for which he was referred to his transplant workup center, where he required admission in ICU due to hypotension and was also on ventilator for few days. He was there in hospital for almost 2 months. During this stay, he lost his urine output completely, and he was also required multiple times of changing his HD sheath in right and left IJV and left femoral. And during this hospital stay, he also underwent right BC AV fistula construction. He was later continued on hemodialysis through AVF thrice weekly at a nearby hemodialysis center. After 2 months of regular hemodialysis, he came to our center for transplantation, and during this workup, he was found to have positive for hepatitis C virus, for which he was started on interferons, but discontinued after 2 doses as he was not tolerant in form of fever and low count. His transplant workup also stopped. He was continued on hemodialysis on positive side thrice weekly with a target weight of 56 kg and intradialytic weight gain of 2.5 to 3 kg, and there is no intra or interdialytic complications, and his BP was controlled with 2 antihypertensives, and he was maintaining hemoglobin of around 10 with EPO of 5000 units twice a week and iron supplements, and not requiring any blood transfusion. After 1 year, he was started developing swelling of fistula arm without any swelling of the face, neck, or anterior wall of the chest, for which he underwent an angiogram and stenting was done. After which his symptoms were better and he was continued on hemodialysis. 3 months later into this, he again had swelling, for which he underwent a graft bypass, followed by his swelling reduced. But later, after a few days, he again had flow issues in the graft, due to which he opted for a peritoneal dialysis and underwent an elective PD catheter insertion in October 2012. After 2 weeks of insertion of PD catheter, he was started on PD, initially with a 1.5% solution, 4 exchanges per day. With this, he developed swelling of the lower limbs, and his blood pressure also rose after a few days, for which his prescription was changed to 4 exchanges of 2.5% solution per day, with which he used to have a ultrafiltrate of 2 to 2.5 liters. At this point of time, he doesn't remember whether any PET test was done or not. Over next few days, his fluid status improved and BP was controlled. He was continued on same prescription without any significant events till 2014. In 2014, patient had a decrease in urine ultrafiltrate to around 1 liter, for which he was evaluated with PET test, the report of which he doesn't know, and his PD prescription was changed to 2.5D solutions thrice a day and night dwell with icodextrin. With this, his UF again improved to 1.5 to 2 liters. He was continued on same prescription without any complications and adequate blood pressure control and maintaining hemoglobin on EPO 5000 twice a week and calcium supplements. In 2018, patient admitted to hospital with history of altered sensorium, without any history of vomiting, fever, headache, seizures, or decreased movement or weakness of limbs, and there was also history of mild swelling of the lower limbs, but no breathlessness. On further questioning, he revealed he was non-compliant with his PD prescription in the past 1 month, and he was doing only 1 icodextrin exchange and 1 2.5 exchange due to his work issues. Patient improved after a frequent exchange. Patient was admitted and he was improved after frequent exchanges of PD. He was retrained and discharged with PD prescription of 2.5% 3 times a day and icodextrin at night. Again in 2019, patient admitted with acute abdominal pain, which is acute in onset, involving the epigastric and periumbilical region, which is continuous in nature, not associated with fever, nausea, vomiting, loose stools, or constipation. There are no changes in There is no change of the postural variation. The PD fluid was clear and there are no flow, though inflow and outflow issues. And he said his PD count was normal, PD cell count was normal at this point of time. On evaluation, he was told that he has issue in his pancreas, which was treated conservatively. During this evaluation, he also found to have there is a damage in his liver, which is found on imaging, for which he was later started on working up for his hepatitis C, and in December 2019, he was started on oral medications for his hepatitis C virus. After 1 month of starting medications, his HCV levels were negative, and he was continued for 3 months, and then his medications were stopped. He again admitted in March 2020 with complaints of loose stools, which was there for 4 days, which is watery in consistency. It is not associated with mucus or blood, and 4 to 5 episodes per day. It is associated with fever for 1 day. There is no abdominal pain or vomiting, and the PD fluid was clear at this point of time, and there are no inflow or outflow issues, and the PD cell count and culture was normal this time. He was treated conservatively and discharged. Now he came for follow-up. At present, he is asymptomatic and on PD with 3 cycles per day, 2.5 solution 2 times, and icodextrin 1 cycle with ultrafiltrate of around 1 to 1.2 liters per day with adequate BP control on 2 antihypertensives and maintaining HB with 40 mcg of CRESP once a week. Past history, there is no history of diabetes, coronary artery disease, CVA or tuberculosis. Personal history, he is compliant with his diet regarding salt and fluid, and he consumes non-vegetarian diet. He has good sleep. He is anuric at present. There is no bowel disturbances. There is no constipation, and he doesn't have any addictive habit. Family history, he is the elder of the 2 siblings, and none of his family members has any significant history of diabetes, hypertension or CKD. His brother, no issues. Treatment history, he is currently on amlodipine, Arcamin and injection CRESP 40 mcg once a week. Sir, shall I tell the case summary? Sir, shall I tell the case summary?
Yeah, case summary, please. Yeah, summarize.
Yes. Sir, here we have a middle-aged man with a history of vaccine-proven FSGS when he was 17 years old and treated with oral medications, probably steroids, after which he lost follow-up and again present with ESRD at the age of 33 years and started on hemodialysis through temporary catheter. Later, he developed CRBSI with septic shock requiring prolonged hospital stay. After that, he was continued on hemodialysis through right BCAFU fistula. During workup for transplant, he was found to have hepatitis C virus, which was treated with initially with interferon, but not completed the course as he had side effects. In 2012, patient had vascular access complications in form of outflow stenosis requiring intervention, which is later upon which also required AV graft bypass, but which also failed subsequently and started on PD. Initially with 1.5D, but later changed due to 2.5 due to inadequate ultrafiltrate. And he again changed his PD prescription in 2014 due to decreased ultrafiltrate. In 2018, patient had probably uremic encephalopathy due to non-compliance, which later improved with regular PD. In 2019, patient had an episode of pancreatitis, and in 2019 he also received oral drugs, probably direct antiviral agents for HCV. Now admitted with acute GE, which was resolved, and currently patient is asymptomatic and euvolemic and adequate BP control and maintaining HB. With this, my provisional diagnosis will be chronic kidney disease stage 5 on continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis with a native kidney disease of probably biopsy proven FSGS with a history of vascular access failure and history of hepatitis C virus, which was treated. systemic hypertension secondary to renoparenchymal disease, and anemia of chronic kidney disease.
Okay. Dr. Ganesh, you've done an excellent presentation. Just a few observations about your history. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes,
number one is that you didn't tell us anything about his immunization status. Did you take any history about any immunization vaccinations that he has received
sir,
after he had?
Sir, he has received only hepatitis. He has received only hepatitis B. Sir. He has not received influenza.
So I don't know whether I missed it or not, but I didn't hear you mention it. So that is, did you mention that history?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Hepatitis B, when he was initiated on hemodialysis, he was received, sir.
Okay.
I mentioned this.
Oh, yes. So I'm sorry that I missed it. Okay. The other thing is that you did mention about dietary history. What is the purpose of taking a dietary history?
Sir, because of one of the common cause for reduced ultrafiltration and fluid overload state in PD patients is non-compliant to the diet, especially salt and fluid. And PD patients also have more protein losses in the PD fluid. Around 5 to 15 grams per day, they will lose protein. So they require adequate protein intake of around 1.2 to 1.5 gram per kg per day.
So in your dietary history, you just mentioned that he was taking a non-vegetarian diet and
yes,
adequate salt and water intake.
Yes.
So is that enough? By that you'll be able to determine whether he's taking good amount of protein or calories that he requires?
No.
The whole idea of taking a dietary history is that whether your patient is taking the desired amount of protein and caloric intake and is adhering to whatever restrictions of salt and fluid, isn't it? So in your dietary history, you just mentioned that he takes a non-vegetarian diet. Well, that it doesn't give you any extra information. Whether he takes non-vegetarian or vegetarian, what difference does it make? You see, what you want to get out of that patient as a doctor is whether he's taking the required amount of protein, the required amount of calories, and how much salt is he taking, and whether the liquid intake is what you have prescribed. That is the whole idea of taking a dietary history. So you need to know what is the protein intake of common food items and make a rough calculation, because you may or may not have a dietitian to help you out in wherever you are working in future. So as a doctor, you must know what is the protein content of various food items and then calculate whether this protein is enough or not. So that is important. You see. Isn't that right? Okay. So now let us come to the beginning. You said that this gentleman in 1994 had presented to his doctor with history of facial puffiness, which was gradually progressive. Suppose you were the treating doctor at that point of time. What would have crossed your mind before doing a biopsy? What are the possibilities that would have crossed your mind at that point of time when he was 70 years of age and had come to you with a history of facial puffiness, which was gradually progressive, with no swelling in legs, no blood in the urine, no sore throat, etc. An investigation has shown
he might be having a nephrotic syndrome, probably podocytopathies like MSD or MCD or FSGS.
Okay, so your first possibility you would think is MCD and second possibility FSGS. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Why do you think it would be MCD or FSGS?
Sir, he's at that point of time, he was 17-year-old and his urine was only protein and there is no other symptoms, and his blood pressure was also normal at that point of time, and creatinine was also normal. So,
okay,
most probably either MCD or FSGS.
Yeah, that is, of course, the points in favor. Any other possibility that you would have thought of at that age?
Sir, there is a mild possibility of IgA nephropathy, sir. Around 5% IgA nephropathy patients can also present with nephrotic syndrome.
Very good. So I would keep, of course, IgA as one of the possibilities, like you have mentioned, because even though it is relatively uncommon to present as a nephrotic syndrome, pure nephrotic syndrome, usually presents nephrotic, and there's no history of sore throat or any blood in the urine. But 17 years of age, you would sort of consider IgA also as one of the possibilities. And I would keep FSGS ahead of MCD. Okay. Now, he did a biopsy on him. And I mean, he had a biopsy and that he turned out to be FSGS. And you said that he was treated with steroids for roughly about 4 months. And his proteinuria, he was treated with steroids for 4 months.
Yes, sir. He was treated with steroids for 4 months.
And then his proteinuria had reduced and his medicines were stopped. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
If you were the treating doctor at that point of time, how would you have treated him?
Yes, sir. Sir, initially I would have treated him with oral prednisolone of 1 gram per 1 milligram per kg body weight per day. Over minimum of 4 weeks till the after the proteinuria is reduced, or maximum of 16 weeks if proteinuria is not reduced. Once proteinuria is reduced, I was continuing minimum total duration of 4 weeks, and then I started tapering him on steroids with starting with 40 mg on alternate day, and I will taper him over next 6 months duration.
Okay. So how does the treatment of FSGS and minimal change disease differ? In minimal change disease, you give steroids.
Yes, sir.
And in FSGS also you give steroids.
Yes, sir.
So how does it differ?
Sir, studies have shown, sir, in FSGS, people needs longer duration of steroids, and sometimes people, even after later duration, if you give steroids also, they will respond. But in MCD, usually they will respond within 1 to 2 weeks after starting the steroids. But FSGS, even after more than up to 16 weeks, they will start responding. They may take time to respond to up to 16 weeks.
No, in minimal change disease, you see in most patients response within 2 weeks time. Is that right? What you're saying?
Yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
Would anybody else like to sort of, if any of the other participants would like to participate, you can unmute themselves and answer if in case they would like to, so we can have more interactive discussion. Anybody else on the group who would like to sort of answer the response to MCD with steroids in adults? Okay, it seems that nobody else is willing to sort of volunteer. In MCD in adults, how long do you give steroids if you don't find the adequate response? You generally give it for 4 weeks, or you give it to a maximum of 8 weeks or to 12 weeks? What is the usual recommendation?
Sir, usually 4 to 8 weeks.
Right. नहीं क्लास में एक वो बल्ला साहब का क्लास से का ओके
Sir, 8 to 12 weeks we will give.
Somebody is in the chat box mentioning 16 weeks. Would you agree?
Yes, sir.
Is it 12 or 16?
16.
Yeah. So it's roughly maximum of 16 weeks. that you can, if you find that there's no response to treatment, then you can give it to 60. The main difference, as you rightly said in the initial, in the beginning, that you in FSGS you treat for a longer period of time, and the tapering is done more slowly. Okay. What is the usual response to steroids in FSGS? Is that 100% response, or is it, what is the response when you, suppose you had been looking after the patient and you had decided to start him on steroids? What would you have counseled him at the time of prescribing steroids? Would you have told him that, look, you will get absent? Yeah, go ahead.
Studies have shown in children the response rate is little higher, of around 70% they will respond, whereas in adults it is slightly lesser, around it is 45 to 50%. And most of the responses, majority they will have partial remission. Complete remission is much lesser, sir. Around only 25 to 30% they will achieve complete remission. Partial remission up to 45 to 50% they can achieve.
And what is partial remission? If you had to explain him in layperson's this thing language, what do you mean by partial remission and what is complete remission?
Sir, partial remission is defined as reduction in the proteinuria from baseline more than 50%, and the proteinuria should be less than 3.5 grams per day, but it is more than 300 milligrams, and the change in creatinine is more than 25% from baseline.
Okay, very good. Okay. Now, is the response also linked to the histology of the condition?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So, how many types of histological types of FSGS you are aware of?
Sir, it is collapsing type, cellular variant, tip variant, perihilar variant, and not otherwise specified variant.
So can you repeat it again? You said that
collapsing variant, cellular variant, cellular variant, tip variant, perihilar variant, and not otherwise specified variant.
The NOS. Okay.
Yes.
So which is the most common type?
Sir, not otherwise specified, NOS type.
NOS is the most common. And which responds to steroids the best and which doesn't respond?
Sir, tip responds to steroids best, sir.
Okay.
Collapsing have poor response. Cellular and NOS have in between.
Okay. Now, what are the causes for collapsing variant of FSGS?
Sir, infections like HIV, parvovirus.
Okay, very
good. And drugs like interferons, sirolimus.
Okay. So when you start him on steroids at the beginning of his treatment, you would have said that, look, you are likely to have a 40 to 50% chance of responding to therapy. And if you have complete remission, would he likely to progress to chronic kidney disease in future, or what would you tell him?
Sir, studies have shown patients who achieved even a partial remission also, the chances of ESRD is very less, and it takes longer duration than people who are not able to achieve the remission.
Okay, perfect. So proteinuria, with the degree of remission of proteinuria would decide what would be his rate of progression in future.
Yes.
But what is the rate of progression? After how many years would a patient have FSGS, and what percentage of patients with FSGS progress to end-stage kidney disease?
Sir, by end of the 10 years, around 60% of FSGS patients will achieve end-stage renal disease.
60%?
60.
Sorry? 60%? 60% of patients who have patients of FSGS would progress to ESRD.
ESRD at the end of 10 years.
Does everybody agree with that? So patients, you would like to qualify your statement by saying that patients who have a nephrotic range proteinuria, they would be the ones where you would have the maximum progression. Those whose proteinuria is less than nephrotic range, the number of patients progressing to ESRD is less. So only about a third of these patients may progress to ESRD over 10 years or so. And if the patient has persistent nephrotic range proteinuria, then 2/3 of the patients would progress to. Now, you said there was a variety called collapsing type of FSGS. So that you said is most resistant to treatment and usually has a, does it have a rapid progression or it
more
is
faster to, yes, rapid progression, sir. They have rapid progression to ESRD.
okay. So there's a term which very often people use known as malignant FSGS. What is malignant FSGS?
Sir, malignant FSGS is one where patients will have nephrotic range proteinuria which not respond to treatments, and the patients usually achieve to ESRD within 5 years of onset.
Okay. And they are likely after if they are transplanted, then
they'll have high chance of recurrence.
Okay. So this gentleman was he took treatment for about 4 months and then he followed up with the doctor for 6 months. What else would you have given him besides steroids in his treatment, as part of his treatment?
Sir, ACE inhibitors and or ARB.
You would have given him ACE inhibitors or ARB. Why?
Yes. Sir, studies have shown either ACE inhibitors or ARBs reduces the proteinuria and it maintains retarding the progression of ESRD.
Yeah, why do they reduce protein? What is the mechanism of action?
Sir, it reduces the proteinuria by decreasing the intraglomerular hypertension. By dilating the efferent arteriole.
Mm-hmm. So thereby the intraglomerular pressures are reduced and the proteinuria is reduced. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. What else would you have done for him?
Sir,
besides ACE, ARB and steroids?
Sir, I will advise him non-specific measures like restriction of protein intake and restriction of salt intake.
So how much protein will you restrict and why do you restrict?
Sir, around maximum allowed is 0.8 grams per kg per day. Studies have shown protein intake of more than 1 gram per kg per day is associated with increased proteinuria and increased progression rate to ESRD.
Suppose his serum albumin is say 2.5, okay, and he has swelling, and you still would like to reduce his protein to 0.8 grams per day in his diet?
No, sir. For the patients with hypoalbuminemia, we should recommend around 1 gram per kg per day body.
Or is it that you reduce to 0.8 and add whatever protein he is losing in the urine?
Yes.
No? What is the recommendation?
So we'll continue. We'll asking them to take 0.8 gram per kg, and we'll add whatever protein loose in the urine.
Yeah. So you'll add 1 to 1.5 times the amount of protein that he is losing in the urine. So that is the thing. And why do we restrict this protein? What is the whole concept of restricting protein?
Exactly.
Sorry?
Yeah, sir, I don't know.
No, I mean, see, some patient is losing protein in the urine. So if you restrict protein, the fellow will become more hyperproteinemic, isn't it?
Yes. Sir, to prevent a hyperfiltration injury.
And that is, somebody has answered that to prevent hyperfiltration. So whoever's answered, can he speak up? Yogesh Mananand, why do you think that hyperfiltration will occur?
Sir, sorry, sir, they don't have an option to speak.
Okay, they don't have
during a webinar. Okay. They can only chat.
Okay. So this hyperfiltration, Ganesh, you also said it's possibly hyperfiltration. You know who gave that theory of hyperfiltration?
No, sir.
The hypothesis, how hyperfiltration worsens renal function.
Sorry, sir, I don't know.
Which textbook of nephrology do you read?
Sir, Oxford and Pihali both.
Have you heard of somebody called Brenner?
Yes, sir.
Have you read his textbook?
Yes, sir. Two topics there is.
Have you heard of Brenner's hypothesis?
Yes, sir.
Huh?
Yes, sir.
Read about Brenner's hypothesis. And you know what that hypothesis is?
Brenner hypothesis is that because of low birth weight and there will be reduced nephron number which lead to hypertension and CKD in later stage.
So Brenner has postulated that if you do this hyperfiltration, which can occur because of various reasons, okay, so that will lead to further loss of nephrons, okay, and again somebody has said that protein itself may be toxic to the tubules, okay. So this is something which is some people consider but may not be agreed by all. Now, if that patient had not responded to steroids, suppose, then what are the other options that you would have? If he is a biopsy proven FSCS, okay, he has some sort of perihilar region. So what else would you have considered? And before that, what else on biopsy, besides the type of the FSCS, what else on biopsy will help you guide or help you sort of at least tell you that what would be the response to treatment? On biopsy, what else will you see on the biopsy report?
IFTA.
Exactly. Very good. So you would like to see whether there's any the amount of interstitial fibrosis and
tubular atrophy.
Because that if there is significant IF, then that would be again a response to steroids may not be very good. Okay. Okay. So so now if this patient had not responded to steroids, or there was a partial response only, and again he relapsed, what are the other options that you have in treating this patient?
Sir, if patient who had response to FSCS and again relapsed, then we can have options of either we can try a oral cyclophosphamide or we can give calcineurin inhibitor, either cyclosporin or tacrolimus, or we can give rituximab. If patient doesn't have any response at all,
which one would you choose?
Sir, patients who had response, I will choose for oral cyclophosphamide.
You will choose for oral cyclophosphamide. Is there data to suggest that cyclophosphamide and steroid combination is very good in FSCS?
Sir, studies have shown patients who are already responding to steroids after achieving remission, if we start a cyclophosphamide, they have better prolonged remission duration.
Okay. Okay. I would sort of not agree totally to that. I would rather prefer to use either a calcineurin inhibitor, or now that there is some data coming out with rituximab, etc., as other options for the treatment of a patient who's either not responded to initial treatment with steroids or has had a relapse. Okay, provided his renal functions are normal and he does not have any infection at that point of time. Now, this patient, you said he came back to you in the year 2010, or he came back to his doctor in 2010 with a history of easy fatigability and found to have advanced failure. His blood pressures are very high at that point of time. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, what would you have suggested to him? He is 33 years of age. He has advanced renal failure. He is hypertensive, and he obviously has uremic symptoms, and you found that he has bilaterally small kidneys on ultrasound. So, what would your advice at that point of time been to him?
Sir, I will first give you the choice of undergoing for renal transplantation.
Why renal transplantation?
Sir, compared to either hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis, patients who underwent a renal transplantation has better survival rate and less morbidity and better quality of life.
Okay. So in terms, suppose he is more specific, he is a well-educated person, he tells you, doctor, tell me what is the survival after transplant and how long is my kidney going to function as in comparison to dialysis, whether it's hemo or peritoneal?
Yes. Sir, according to USRDS data, 1 year graft survival is around 97% and patient survival is around 98%, and 10-year graft survival is around, if it is a live donor, 10-year graft survival is around 70%, and patient survival is around 85%. Whereas in hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis, the survival rates are much less. At the 5-year survival rates with hemodialysis is only 50 to 60%.
50 to 60 is very high. I think it's less than 50%. It's about 40 to 50% in hemo and peritoneal. Okay. So you would say that transplantation is better because one is the survival of the kidney and survival of the individual is much higher as compared to staying on dialysis. And what else?
Sir, is better quality of life also better, and there are less morbidities rather than patient is on dialysis.
Okay. What morbidities?
Sir, in terms of cardiovascular morbidities and other even vascular related problems. In case of hemodialysis patients, there will be vascular related problems, whereas in PD patients there will be chance of PD peritonitis.
Okay. What else? What else?
Sir, even infection rates also slightly higher in hemodialysis patients. Infection rates also slightly higher in hemodialysis patients.
Okay. Anything else?
Sir, in case of children, there will be growth and development will be better in the transplantation.
No, he's not a child. He's 33 years of age. What about mineral bone disease?
Yes. Mineral bone disease is better in transplantation.
So the chances of his developing renal osteodystrophy are much more if he stays on dialysis as compared to getting a transplant.
Yes.
So those are the things that you would say are positive for a transplant.
Yes.
What is negative for a transplant? See, when you counsel a patient, you have to tell him both the things, positive things as well as
yes. Sir, I'll tell the patient about the risk for resection and graft loss.
Okay.
And I will tell the patients about the risks of infection due to immunosuppression agents. And I will tell the patients about the increased risk of malignancies, especially skin malignancies.
Okay. Anything else that you like to tell them? People are already putting the chat box. A lot of people are writing.
Risk of recurrence.
Very good.
It is FSGS. It is FSGS for risk of recurrence.
So in FSGS recurrence, what is the recurrence like?
Sir, if it is a FSGS due to genetic cause, there is no chance of recurrence. But if it is due to any circulating substances or any other FSGS, the chance of recurrence is around 30 to 40%.
So almost a third or maybe even a half of the patients can develop recurrence. And if it is a particularly, if it's a collapsing variant or a malignant FSGS, then the chances of recurrence are much, much higher and much faster. Okay, so when you counsel the patient, you tell him all these things that look your positive thing as well as all the things about rejection, infections, as well as about recurrence and obviously malignancy, etc. that you mentioned. Now, this patient decided to, or the doctor then decided to start him on hemodialysis. Do you agree with the choice of or the modality of choice of dialysis?
Sir, actually, PD first choice is the preferred.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Sir, because patients on PD, they will have better residual renal function, which results in better survival rates and better quality of life. Patients who had preserved renal function, they also have better mineral bone disease rates also.
Mm-hmm.
And,
so why do you say that? Why do you say that patients on PD or patients who have residual renal function have better quality of life and better, less bone disease, etc., less mortality? What is the evidence to that effect?
So studies have shown in the first 2 to 3 years, PD has better mortality compared to hemodialysis because especially in hemodialysis patients, in the first 1 year, they are more prone for increased.
So is it that they have can you name any landmark study for telling us?
Sir, ADAMEX trial and Hong Kong trial.
ADAMEX and Hong Kong. Okay. ADAMEX trial was looked at what? What was ADAMEX study? What is the full form of ADAMEX study? Adequacy.
Sir, adequacy of peritoneal dialysis in Mexico patients.
So we are talking about residual renal function. So which was the first study which looked at that? Somebody has written, Yogeshwan Anand has given you the answer.
Canusa?
Yes, Canusa study. So Canusa study was a Canadian-USA study where they looked at the PD patients and they found that those who had urine output and these
more than 250 ml.
And this Canusa study was revisited by Joanne Bargman, and then she published this again, and she found that every 250 ml of urine output, the mortality is okay. So the question then comes is that this patient had a urine output of 1000 ml per day, you mentioned, at the start of dialysis. So would you have considered starting something known as incremental dialysis?
Yes, sir.
And
yes,
what
sir,
is
incremental hemodialysis?
क्लास चल रहा है उनसे कह दो कि 11 बजे के पहले sorry, go ahead.
Yes, sir, incremental hemodialysis has shown benefit of
incremental dialysis, whether it's hemo or peritoneal, they could be incremental in both.
Yes. Sir, it has shown benefit of delay in the loss of residual renal function.
No, so there will be delay in the loss of residual renal function, but how? What is the usual way that one does incremental dialysis?
Sir, it is usually initially once or twice a week dialysis.
Once or twice
based on the patient requirement. Based on the patient
hemodialysis. Of hemodialysis?
Yes, sir. Hemodialysis.
And peritoneal dialysis?
Sir, peritoneal dialysis, it is use of less hypertonic solutions like 1.5 solution with achieving a minimum required ultrafiltrate.
Okay. Yeah. So you can, in peritonitis is one exchange. You can start off if your EGFR is around 10, then you can gradually increase it 2 exchanges per day if your EGFR is between 8, 7 to 9, and then make it 3 exchange 5 to 7, and less than 5 you go to 4 exchanges. Now, but why do people feel that in hemodialysis the rate of loss of residual renal function is more rapid as compared to peritoneal dialysis?
Sir, hemodialysis patients are more prone for undergoing hypotension, and there will be complement activation because of the dialyzer reaction, and there will be chronic inflammation which results in loss of residual renal function.
Mm-hmm. So there is complement activation because of
dialyzer activation. The complements are activated over the dialyzer membranes.
So there is a process of inflammation which starts,
Yes.
and which sort of activates the complement activation, and therefore it leads to further
Loss
renal
of renal
dysfunction,
dysfunction.
and
Yes.
and therefore can lead to loss of
Rapid
residual.
loss of. Yes.
The other important features of preserving the residual renal function is, besides, you said that less mortality, less mineral bone disease, what else?
Sir,
What are the other advantages?
they have better cardiovascular profile.
Okay, less cardiovascular morbidity. What else?
And decreased requirement of erythropoietin or darbepoietin.
So anemia is less. Yes. What else?
So they have better acid-base control.
Okay. What else? Nutrition.
Yes, nutrition.
Less evidence of malnutrition. Okay. Nutritionally, they are little better off if those patients who have residual renal function. Okay. Now, you said that this patient was started on dialysis through a right IJV catheter. Is that right? Internal jugular catheter was placed. And thereafter, he was suggested to go for a transplant. And then he went on to, he became sick. He went to the ICU, was on a ventilator, and he remained that's in the ICU for 2 months. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then he became anuric.
Yes, sir. During the hospital stay, he was anuric.
So why do you think he became anuric?
Sir, because of this septic shock and all, already patient is ESRD patient. So whatever residual renal function is there, it is lost either because of sepsis-related AKI or hypotension-related AKI, ischemic ATN or sepsis-related ATN he might have had, which results in a lot of complete residual renal function.
So he may have developed sepsis. He may have been, you think any drugs could have been given to him in the ICU that could have also worsened his condition, his renal functions?
Yes, sir. Nephrotoxic medications, antibiotics.
So if somebody had prescribed in nephrotoxic antibiotics, okay, and or he may have been ultrafiltered to previously stay in the, all that may have contributed to his further deterioration of his renal function. And he became
residual renal function.
And he became anuric. Okay. Then he said that he started having multiple vascular access problems, and he required regular changing of his IJV from right to left and left to right, and femoral catheterizations were also done. And ultimately, an arteriovenous fistula was created on his left hand. Is that right? A brachial arteriovenous.
Right arm. Right arm.
Okay. And then he was diagnosed to have hepatitis C infection.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
He was diagnosed to have hepatitis C infection, and he was.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, what is the treatment for hepatitis C? When they develop dialysis patients who develop hepatitis C infection, what is the treatment for that?
Sir, according to 2018 KDIGO guidelines, the treatment of HCV, whether patient is undergoing near transplantation or will he take time, or whether he is opted for a living donor transplantation or a deceased donor transplantation. If patient is opted for a deceased donor transplantation, and if is the chance of getting a HCV positive kidney at an early age, then we have to wait till the patient undergoes transplant with a HCV positive kidney, and then we have to treat. If it is not getting any HCV positive kidney or getting in transplant delayed, then we have to treat him early. If it is a case of live transplant and which is possible within 3 to 4 months, then we can wait for HCV treatment, and then we have to, after transplant, immediate transplant period, we have to start him on HCV treatment. If the transplant is getting delayed, we have to treat him first for HCV, and then we have to go for transplant.
Mm-hmm.
If he is not going for transplant at all, if he is not going to go for transplant at all, then we have to treat him with HCV. And based on the genotype of the HCV, we have to treat whether it is type 1 or type 4.
Okay.
And then we have to treat.
Okay. So, excellent. This patient was, you said, that was treated with interferon. Maybe those days the drugs that we are now using were not available. And he said that he was given two injections of interferon, and thereafter it was stopped.
Yes.
So, what are the side effects of interferon therapy?
Sir, they can have flu-like reaction.
What else?
They can have anaphylactic reactions.
Thank you.
They can have anaphylactic reaction. They can have reactivation of the infection.
Okay. What else?
And they can have other newer infections like the viral infections. They can have infections like CMV.
Okay, very good. Mm-hmm. Okay. And usually at the, have you ever treated any patient with interferon? Or
No.
have you? No, you have not. Okay. So have you read about treatment prior to DAs when they were available? Interferon, and it was usually given alone, or was it combined with some other drug?
Sir, usually till 2012, before DAS approved, it was the treatment with pegylated interferon along with ribavirin, plus or minus the protease inhibitor.
Right, right. So ribavirin was the other drug that was given in combination with interferon. And ribavirin was the one problem with ribavirin was that it used to produce
hemolysis. They will have hemolysis in hemodialysis patients.
Very good. So it was producing edema. So it was usually very difficult to treat these patients because very many of these patients would not tolerate a combination of the two drugs, and then we would have to stop and wait. Okay. Now, what is the usual? Suppose, I mean, he has now become HCV positive, and he is still interested in transplant. So, as a doctor, what would you have told him? That his survival of his kidney and himself would be the same as that of a non-HCV patient, or is it different?
Sir, now or at that point of time, sir?
No, when in that time when he was first diagnosed to have hepatitis C.
Yes, sir. At that point of time, before the era of direct antiviral agents, HCV they have less kidney survival rates, sir, and they are more risk for rejection, and they have more risk of other HCV related new de novo GN, and they have reactivation of hepatitis C, which results in increased loss of liver tissue, and they will more prone for development of cirrhosis and hepatocellular carcinoma.
Okay. Now, which infection is worse as compared, from the kidney point of view? Is it hepatitis B or is it hepatitis C? In patients who are going for a transplant, in the post-transplant period, which infection would have a greater adverse impact on patient survival?
Sir, hepatitis C.
Hepatitis?
C.
Are you sure?
Yes, sir.
Not hepatitis B?
No, sir.
And why do you say that?
Sir, hepatitis C is associated with increased risk of developing for post-transplant diabetes mellitus. It is associated with increased risk of rejection. It is associated with increased chance of going for cryoglomulinic type of MPGN, or it is associated with increased chance of other GNs like either non-cryoglobulinic MPGN or MN.
Okay, very good. But from the liver point of view, in the post-transplant status,
Yes.
hepatitis B is more likely to cause cirrhosis of liver and malignancy. So therefore, the patient survival will be poorer with
In
hepatitis
hepatitis B.
infection as
Yes.
compared to hepatitis C in the post-transplant.
Yes.
So the correct answer would be hepatitis B actually. In a patient, I asked you about patient survival. Okay, the patient survival will be affected because of liver disease getting worse, cirrhosis, and malignancy as compared to hepatitis C.
B. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this patient was you said that he was being dialyzed in an isolation group
Yes.
when he was first diagnosed to have hepatitis C.
Yes.
Is it right? You said that.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So is that what you do? What you normally is recommended?
Sir,
That should
normal.
be done on a separate side.
No, sir. No, sir. The guidelines says recommendations say no need for separate isolation.
Okay. What does the Indian Society of Nephrology guidelines say?
No need for separation of isolation.
Mm-hmm. See, the guidelines, the international guidelines say that do not need isolation, but I think the Indian Society of Nephrology, if I'm not wrong, suggests that as far as possible try and isolate these patients because there is a possibility of cross infection to others. Okay, so sometimes if you have space in your unit. Okay. Now this gentleman you said was on 3 times a week hemodialysis, and
Yes.
he was getting his weight gain was between 2.5 to 3 kilograms. Is that right?
Yes.
So what
Yes,
is
sir.
the desirable weight gain? You know, if somebody comes, he's on 3 times a week hemodialysis. He still comes with a weight gain, interdialytic weight gain of 2.5 to 3 kilos. Is that acceptable, or you would have said no, you're still
No,
gaining
sir.
too much of weight. Be careful.
No, sir. 1 to 1.5 kg is acceptable.
Sorry.
Sir, 1 to 1.5 kg of interdialytic weight gain is acceptable.
Okay. Why 1 to 1.5? Why not 2?
Sir, it helps in better hemodynamic profile, sir. If we remove more ultrafiltrate, there is a more chance of patient going for myocardium. There will be chance of myocardial stunning and increased cardiovascular mortality and morbidity.
Okay. So therefore, you need to sort of advise your patients that be careful about the amount of weight that you're gaining, and because it may have an adverse impact, etc. Okay. Now, suppose this patient were to sort of develop hypotension during dialysis. Okay. You know, he tells you that, look, doctor, every time they're ultrafiltering me, and my blood pressure is going down. So what does it mean?
So there may be, because of excessive ultrafiltration removal, they may be having hypotension because this is the excessive circulatory volume.
So what will you try and see if he's getting, whenever they're ultrafiltering him, his blood pressure is dropping. So what all will you try and think? What could be the possible causes for this?
So because of he might be having a fluid overload state, so we have to ask him to reduce his salt intake and fluid intake.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to, if he had any residual urine output, we can add diuretics to him to reduce
I'm asking
ultrafiltrate.
How would you manage? You see, a patient reports to you that on dialysis, his blood pressure is dropping when they're
Yes.
ultrafiltering you. Okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
what will come to your mind? What could be the possible causes in such a patient, and how will you evaluate such a patient?
Sir, patient may be having either we are removing excess ultrafiltrate more than 10 ml per kg per hour, or patient may be having a low cardiac output status, or patient might be having a autonomic neuropathy.
Okay. Now, the first thing that should come to your mind is that has his dry weight increased? Okay. You know the concept
Hello.
of dry weight? Dry weight?
Yes, sir.
Can
Yes,
you
sir.
hear
Yes,
me?
sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So
Yes,
the first thing could be that it is possible that his dry weight may have increased. Okay.
yes,
So he doesn't have
yes,
the weight gain, maybe because he's eating much better. Okay.
yes,
So you need to find out whether his nutrition is good. His dry weight,
yes,
what is his likely dry weight? Has it increased than what it was in the past?
yes,
Okay.
yes,
The second thing, obviously, you must find out whether he has cardiac status is okay or not. Like you do all that evaluation by echo and other things. Number three, you find out whether you're doing it more rapidly. As you said, the ultrafiltration rate may be more rapid as compared to what is desirable. And so suppose his dry weight has not increased, but you still need to ultrafilter him and you still need to dialyze him, which you will have
yes.
to. So what are the things that you would do? What are the...
Sir, we can do either sodium profiling or ultrafiltrate profiling, or we can do increased frequency of the dialysis, and or we can increase the duration of the dialysis.
What is the sodium and profiling and using ultrafiltration profiling?
Sir, in the profiling, we will initially in the ultrafiltrate profiling, in the initial 1 hour, we will remove more ultrafiltrate volume, and over the end of the duration of the dialysis, we will reduce the amount of ultrafiltrate we will remove. Whereas in sodium profiling, initially we will keep the dialysate sodium more than 145, and over the next few hours, the sodium will keep reducing to less than 135.
Mm-hmm. So sodium you gradually bring down. You start with the higher sodium levels, and ultrafiltration you start with a higher level and then reduce it, or is it the other way around?
Initially, we'll keep a higher ultrafiltrate and then reduce in the first 1 hour.
You can do it. You can introduce the sodium gradually, and you can gradually increase the ultrafiltration rather than increasing the ultrafiltration more at the initial stage. And you can also reduce the temperature of the dialysate. True?
Yes, low dialysate temperature.
Now this fellow, over a period of time, he developed the fistula stenosis, which was dilated, stenting was done, and thereafter he had a graft bypass also done, and ultimately the fistula failed.
Yes.
Okay, and he was decided to put him on peritoneal dialysis.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Now he is an anuric patient.
Yes, sir.
So what is his long-term outcome on PD?
Sir, based on his peritoneal membrane status and ultrafiltrate volume, in the EPOSA study and NECOSAD study, they have shown that if patient is able to achieve more than 750 ml per day of ultrafiltrate, then the survival chances are very high. And with that, the ERBP recommends a minimum of 1 liter per day ultrafiltrate.
So you said the NECOSAD and the EPOS study has shown that if you should have an ultrafiltration of at least in excess of 750 ml or 1 liter, so that these patients would be able to survive on PD. If they have the ultrafiltration less than 750 ml, then their survivals are very poor. Okay.
Yes.
So when you start a patient on peritoneal dialysis, like he was started,
Yes.
What is the PD prescription that you would write?
Sir, in the first, when we are training him for PD, we should start with low volume of around 1 to 1.5 liter with less exchanges of around 2 exchanges per day. As patient adapts to the PD fluid in the abdomen, then we can keep on increasing the PD fluid, and then we can increase the exchanges per day also. And we have to try empirical PD prescription in the first 1 month.
So you said that you start with 2 exchanges a day. So why do you want to do incremental dialysis in him? He is already anuric. He's been on hemodialysis for a good 2-3 years. Now he has developed vascular
No,
access.
sir. Only for only for for 2 to 3 days only, sir. After once the patient getting trained and can do himself, then within 3-4 days we can increase for 4 exchanges, 3 to 4 exchanges.
Okay. So when
Based
do you
on the ultrafiltrate,
when do you start him on? He has a catheter inserted, either surgically or percutaneously. And so when do you want to start him on PD?
Sir, usually it will give gap of 2 weeks, sir. After 2 weeks.
What is the whole idea of giving a gap?
Sir, the gap idea for giving a break-in period is to allow the inserted catheter to heal so that there won't be any pericatheter leaks.
So you want exit site to be healed, and you want fibrosis to develop around the exit site.
Yes.
Okay. So there is no migration.
And the cups also, sir. Inside the cups. Also.
Yeah. So there's no migration of bacteria along the catheter from the exit site. Okay. And you said that you start with small volume exchanges whenever you start the PD, and increase the volume and then increase the number of exchanges. And you said the initial prescription would be of lower concentration, and see how the patient tolerates and how much of ultrafiltration he or she is.
Yes.
Okay. Now, this gentleman said that he was suggested to do 1.5% bags, 4 exchanges per day. Is that right? Initially?
Yes, sir.
And then
yes, sir. Initially he was in the first few weeks.
And then he returned to you with increased swelling and increased blood pressure.
Yes.
So what does it mean? Suppose you were the treating doctor at that time. You started this patient on CAPD. You have found that he was reasonably stable. You sent him home, and 3 months later he comes to you with increased swelling and his blood pressures are uncontrolled.
Yes.
So what will you do?
Sir, usually they might have inadequate ultrafiltration, or they're not diet controlled with diet. Sir, first I will rule out any whether he's having adequate. I will ask whether he's having how is the flow patterns, whether inflow and outflow are adequate, whether it is taking any prolonged time or whether it is finishing within 10 to 15 minutes. If there is no flow issues, then I will take one erect X-ray and I will see the position of the catheter. And if the position of the catheter is normal, I will ask them to and I will ask about whether is a dietary intake, whether sodium and water intake is compliant or not. And I will see if everything is okay, then I will do a PET test and I will see the membrane character, and I will decide whether he requires any increase in the concentration of the PD fluid.
See, whatever you said was absolutely right. But before you start, you need to make sure that whether this is true ultrafiltration related problems, or is it because of non-compliance? You said that this patient in future, actually you mentioned that he was non-compliant and he was doing 2 exchanges because of office work, etc., etc. So how do you assess that whether this is true ultrafiltration failure, or it is because of non-compliance?
Sir, we can do a modified PET test with 4.5 PD solution for 4 hours, where if we get an ultrafiltrate of more than 400 ml for 4 hours, then patient is not having ultrafiltrate failure. It is mainly due to non-compliance. If the ultrafiltrate is less than 400 ml per 4 hours.
Very good, very good. So if you do, first you do a 4.25% bag, you put in, and for 4 hours, and if you get a UF in excess of 400 ml, that is you get 2400 out, then you will you will say that this is
It is
because
a
of
non-compliance.
compliance and not because of any problem. Now,
Non-compliance.
once you are sure that there is an ultrafiltration related problem, then you will go ahead and do what you said,
Yes.
that get a flat X-ray of the abdomen to see the position of the catheter.
Yes.
Then you will see whether he's constipated.
Yes.
Okay. What are the other causes? What are the other causes? Besides the
Sir,
position?
there can be increased lymphatic absorption or pericatheter leak into the abdominal walls, or there can be leak into the pleural cavity causing pleural effusion.
Okay. So there could be a loss of the fluid going into other spaces, either into the pleural space,
Yes.
to the anterior abdominal wall, and third in the,
Yes.
where else?
Lymphatic space. Lymphatic.
No, besides lymphatics.
Lymphatic absorption.
Besides lymphatic absorption. Pleural space, anterior abdominal wall, and third could be the genital areas.
Sir, it could be hernial. Yes, sir. Genital or
The
hernial
genital
as well.
areas. If there's a scrotal swelling or a labial swelling, if there is it's a female. Okay. So check for all these things, and then you can find out whether there is fluid escaping elsewhere and not coming out. Okay. And
Yes.
if none of these are there, and if your position of your catheter is okay, then it is likely to be related to something in the membrane. But within 3 months, it's very unlikely that your membrane would have altered significantly.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now, the other thing about PD prescription is, you said that you will start with low volume and low concentration. Is also the PD prescription, initial PD prescription is determined also by the size of the patient.
Body surface area.
Yeah, body surface area, that is weight and the size. Okay, so the body surface area will determine. So if you have a child or a very emaciated patient as compared to somebody who is extremely healthy, the PD prescriptions are going to be different. Okay, and the third thing is the degree, the amount of urine output. If it's less than GFR is less than 2 or more than 2 ml per liter. Okay, if the residual renal function is present or absent, again that will determine your initial PD prescription. You said that this patient then he again came in, and this time somebody did a PET, peritoneal equilibration
Yes,
test.
sir, in 2014, sir. After 2 years, after 2 years of starting PD, sir.
His ultrafiltration came down to 1 liter, and then somebody did a PET. What is this peritoneal equilibration test?
Sir, peritoneal equilibration test is to evaluate the type of the membrane and what are the type of transporter he is.
Mm-hmm. You know how to do it? What is the, if you have to tell your nurse to do this peritoneal equilibration test, what is the instructions that you will give her?
Sir, first we ask the patient to come with a 8 to 12 hours of overnight well of 2.5 solution.
Mm-hmm.
After he reaches the hospital, we have to. Sir?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sir, after he reaches the hospital, we have to completely drain the well PD fluid in a erect posture, and the drain period should be within 15 to 20 minutes. After completely draining the PD fluid, we have to make him supine and start PD fluid infusion with 2.5 solution. And for every 400 ml, we have to rotate the patient to lateral side so that PD fluid will go to the all over the peritoneal cavity. And after completion of the PD fluid, after PD fluid infusion, at the 0 hour, we have to take 200 ml of PD fluid and mix it well and collect 10 ml of sample for glucose, creatinine, and reinfuse the remaining 190 ml and ask the patient to be ambulatory for next 4 hours. At the time of 2 hours and 4 hours, again we have to take the samples of 10 ml PD fluid, and at the time of 2 hours, we have to take a blood sample for glucose, urea, creatinine, and sodium.
Okay.
And
At the end of 4 hours?
At the end of 4 hours, again we have to take the only dialysis samples for glucose, urea, and creatinine, and we have to see what is the ultrafiltrate volume he has achieved.
Okay. So then you will send this to the lab, okay, and you will get certain values, okay,
Yes.
of,
Yes.
so you will get the dialysate value of glucose, you will get dialysate value of urea, you will get dialysate value of creatinine, okay,
Yes.
and you will get that at 0 hours, you will get that at 2 hours, and you will get 4 hours, and you will get blood glucose, you will get serum creatinine, okay. Then what do you do? How do you sort of then?
Sir, we have to take the D by P creatinine and D by P urea to see the solute transporter, and for dP by D0 of glucose to see the solute transporter. If he is a low transporter, he will have mean minus 2 standard deviations, that is around less than 0.5 of D by P creatinine for low transporter. And high transporter is more than 0.8 of D by P creatinine, and in between is high average and low average transporter.
Do you need to correct the creatinine for glucose? Is there some correction factor for every lab?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There is, no?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You know how to
that
correct?
University of Missouri 0.005.
No, Missouri has given it for its own lab. You can do it for your own lab also.
Sir, before infusing the
you
patient,
there's a formula. So there is a formula by which you can calculate the correction factor, and then you can correct your creatinine values and then accordingly plot.
Yes.
You know who designed this PET?
Sir, Dr.
Twardowski, very good. Okay, Zubir Twardowski, he designed it and he did it in the University of Missouri, where they did it in about 800 patients. And then they sort of found the mean values, and then there's sort of 1 standard deviation above and 2 standard deviations above, like you mentioned, and 1 standard deviation below and 1 standard deviation. So normally most of the patients, they are what? High transporters or high average or low average or low?
Sir, majority of the patients will be average transporters. Around 60% will be average transporter, either high or low average. And around 15 to 20% will be low transporters, and 15 to 20% will be high transporters.
Yeah. So most of the patients, they are in between, they fall in the middle thing, and you have this bell-shaped curve where you have the outliers lying on the fluid. So suppose somebody is a low transporter. What does it mean?
Yes. Sir, low transporter is they are able to they have a very low transport rate of the solutes across the peritoneal membrane. So they will have less clearance, but they will achieve good ultrafiltrate.
They'll have good ultrafiltration but less clearance. Are they suitable for peritoneal dialysis?
Sir, usually the peritoneal success will be less in them, the low transporters.
So they should be given a combination of peritoneal hemodialysis, because their creatinine levels are going to be very high, or they should be on augmented peritoneal dialysis, or they should be transferred to hemodialysis.
High volume
transporters, they will have, what will their problem be? If they're high transporters, what is their problem? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, high transporters.
Patient,
hello, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, high transporters, they have.
Go ahead.
Sir, high transporters, they have high ultrafiltrate. Low ultrafiltrate, but a high clearance. But even the clearance is also achieve they achieve the equilibrium at very early. So we have to give the dialysis but very frequent exchanges, like APD we have to do. If we keep the well for more than 4 hours, their solutes concentration again decreases and their clearance again further reduces.
So survivals in high transporters are inferior to those with high average and low average?
Yes, sir.
Are the survivals less?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Less survivals.
Why?
Sir, because of poor ultrafiltrate rates, so they will have more volume overload states and increased hypertension and cardiovascular morbidity.
Okay, very good. Very good. Now, this patient his prescription was changed and he was started on icodextrin in addition to 2.5%, 3 bags a day. And you said that he became better and he thereafter, he got again readmitted because of uremic encephalopathy. He was not doing dialysis. And then he developed in 2019 severe acute abdominal pain. And he said that somebody diagnosed him as having pancreatitis.
Yes, sir.
So is pancreatitis more common in patients on peritoneal dialysis as compared to those on hemodialysis?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Why?
Sir, studies have shown icodextrin is associated with increased incidence of peritonitis.
No,
pancreatitis. Pancreatitis. Icodextrin is associated with pancreatitis.
Okay. Now, so what would be the treatment of a patient who develops pancreatitis and is on peritoneal dialysis? Do we need to stop his peritoneal dialysis and change over to hemodialysis?
No, sir. No, sir. We can continue on peritoneal dialysis.
But you're saying that icodextrin is associated with more incidence of pancreatitis. So if you continue using icodextrin, how will his pancreatitis resolve?
Not sure. Not sure.
Anybody else? See, as there is some suggestion to say that patients on peritoneal dialysis may be more prone to develop pancreatitis as compared to those on hemodialysis. And some people have suggested, though not everybody agrees, that there could be a temporary changeover from peritoneal dialysis to hemodialysis. You give rest to the abdomen. Okay. And once the pancreatitis resolves, then you can change it back. Whereas, as somebody has suggested, that some people, on the other hand, believe that peritoneal dialysis may be a treatment for acute pancreatitis. So, at the moment, majority of the people will not change over the patient or give abdominal rest. But if your pancreatitis is very prolonged and not resolving, then for some time you may need to change over to hemodialysis. Now, pancreatitis can also, what are the ways that a pancreatitis may present? Apart from abdominal pain, anything else?
So they can present with left pleural effusion, or they can present with sepsis, or they can present with change in the cloudy effluent. They can present with cloudy effluent or bloody effluent.
Cloudy effluent, what else?
Bloody effluent and
very good. So you can remember that one of the important causes of hemorrhagic effluent, you suspect that the patient may have pancreatitis.
Pancreatitis.
What are the other causes of hemorrhagic effluent?
Sir, it may be because of in females like rupture of the hemorrhagic cyst of the ovaries, or during ovulation they can have.
Okay, retrograde menstruation, rupture of this thing. In what else?
Sir, like in patients with ADPKD who had a cyst rupture, they can have hemorrhagic pancreatitis. Sorry, hemorrhagic effluent.
May or may not. Yeah. Okay. What else? More important.
Sir, malignancy. Patients with malignancy
very
can
good.
have.
Very good.
Yes.
And you can have peritonitis also presenting.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So those could be other causes. If you have a patient presenting to you with a hemorrhagic effluent, then you should think of these things. Pancreatitis being top of the list. If you have a young female, then retrograde menstruation could be one of the important causes of. Okay. Now, he was treated conservatively, and then he was found to have, somebody said that his liver was found to be damaged. Is that right? And his Hep C RNA levels are found to be high, and he was started on this DAs,
Oral DA.
right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
by liver damage, suppose this fellow wants to go in for transplant now. You think
Yes, sir.
you would suggest him a transplant?
Sir, we have to see the what is the whether it is a compensated cirrhosis or a decompensated cirrhosis, and we have to see whether how is the portal hypertension. If patient is a compensated cirrhosis without any portal hypertension, then we can opt him for a liver only kidney transplantation. If patient is having a decompensated cirrhosis, then we have to opt him for a simultaneous liver kidney transplantation.
Very good. So therefore, he has to go for a simultaneous liver and kidney transplantation if there is decompensated
Decompensation.
liver
Yes.
disease. Okay.
Yes.
What are the other problems that you have when you do a combined kidney and liver transplant?
The problems, they have more, it is a prolonged surgery, so there is a increased risk of delayed graft function.
What else?
And because of delayed graft function, there may be, there is also further increased risk for rejection episodes, especially ABMR.
Okay, that's one. What else?
Sir, it is, they also have increased perioperative morbidity and mortality.
The main problem is
compared to
the fluids, see, because from the liver point of view, they do not want excessive fluids because it sort of creates this edema of the liver, etc. And whereas for your renal point of view, your fluid has to be given in a reasonable amount, a fair amount. So that is where one of the major problems that you have in the peri-operative period. Okay. Secondly, the immunosuppression, long-term immunosuppression in liver transplant is much lower as compared to what you give in a patient with a kidney transplantation. So those are the problems that you can encounter in patients with combined liver and kidney transplantation. Okay. Dr. Bhalla and Dr. Rana sir, would you like to ask some questions? Because I have asked too many questions.
No, sir, you have covered everything, sir.
I'm sure you still may have some one or two questions to ask.
You have covered everything. You discussed case as a whole. This case had multiple actually problems and covered very nicely, sir.
So it's already 10:35.
Yes, sir. Yes, yes.
So do you think we should wind up, or would you like to ask questions?
No, I think most of the questions have been covered. I would just like to highlight that Professor Gupta has highlighted on dietary history, which is very important in a nephrology patient, and vaccination history. Please do not forget. Then importance of dietary history is very important because protein intake and how to advise protein intake is very important. So nutrition is a very, very important part of nephrology practice. And this is sorry state that today Brenner's hypothesis is somehow not remembered by the students. We were trained by reading Brenner only. And today's students, they don't know the name of Brenner. They know only two things. One is, and this is a Fiery book, and other is Oxford book. And plus up to date.
Easy to read, I guess. That's why Brenner has too much of experimental data. So they don't want to read that actually.
Yes, and Brenner was a very difficult book. But today, the hyperfiltration theory, which is so famous of Brenner's theory, I am sorry to say that most of the students today, they don't know the name of Brenner at all, sir. That is the situation today. Then he has discussed about MCNS versus FSGS and steroid treatment, how to give treatment in both. Then importance of hepatitis B and hepatitis C infection, which one is bad post-transplant. Then about PD prescription, how to do PET test, what is the significance, then pancreatitis, hemorrhage return, and transplant. So practically every aspect has been covered. And I'm sure I have highlighted these points because these points are very relevant. And in the exam, you are going to be asked these questions. Because Dr. Amit Gupta is in most of the time, he is examiner for DM and DNB every year. and I'm sure all of you have gained. There were, sir, 140 total, including YouTube viewers, and so many students have gained from your bedside. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to.
Yes, sir. And in future also, sir, please you will agree to our request whenever we have again
Sure,
bedside.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Ganesh, you have done a good job.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Dinesh, good.
Sir,
Thank you, sir, for giving the, sir, thank you, sir, for giving this opportunity to present.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Balaji. I think once again, on behalf of Microlabs, we specifically thank Dr. Amit Gupta ji and Dr. Ganesh ji for their valuable presentation and exchange of knowledge. And I'm sure this was useful for each and every student. And as we generally believe that the teachers set the path, and there is always, we try to learn something new from every teacher. And we cannot have a better example than Dr. Amit ji by himself. So with this note, I once again thank all the students for having joined on today's webinar. And we would once again request you to join on our next edition on next Monday. So until then, bye-bye. Have a great weekend. Thank you.